Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to a quick little banner review. And by quick little, I mean long banner review for the upcoming banners for second phase of 4.6. So, we have a Wanderer and Baizhu as the 5 stars, and then you have Beidou, Faruzan, and Layla as the 4 stars. On the weapon banner, you have the Bell, Catalyst version, Baiju's signature, Jadefall Splendor, and then you have a Range Gauge, Favonia's Sword, Sacrificial Fragments, Prospectors Drill, and Rainslasher. Start with the character banner. Wanderer is definitely a character of all time. He's not a bad character, but he's also not a great one. His base performance without C6 Faruzan, which we'll talk about in a little bit because Faruzan is on banner, but his base performance without C6 Faruzan is honestly kind of underwhelming, but with C6 Faruzan, he's actually pretty good. Now, I'd say that with the release of Xianyun, there are really not too many situations where Wanderer will end up performing better than Xiao, unless you're looking at high constellation characters, because Wanderer scales a bit better with cons than Xiao does. Generally, Wanderer will tend to perform a bit worse than Xiao, all things considered, but yeah. Now, overall, that doesn't mean that he's not good. Like, at the end of the day, he's not bad, he's just whatever. And he does have advantages that don't directly translate to his just overall strength in a vacuum. He is one of the best characters for Overworld. His elemental skill lets him go really, really fast and hover over shit, which is quite useful when you're doing Overworld stuff. He is not burst reliant at all, which is also nice for a different kind of Overworld stuff, which is like, you know, when you're doing exploration, you want to kill enemies, you don't have to use your burst for anything. Because enemies are so squishy in Overworld, it kind of feels bad to play burst reliant characters, because you use your burst, they die, and then you don't have your burst for the next group of enemies. So he has that going for him. Even in Abyss and like quote-unquote difficult content, his ability to hover against some enemies will let him avoid a good portion of their attacks, and his ability to shoot enemies from range while he himself is relatively high up allows him to hit a lot of enemies that are mobile, that move around, that go in the air and don't fall down. Enemies like namely the Wolf Lord. It's very noticeable how useful Wanderer's, I'll call it reach, I guess. His ability to reach enemies, but how useful Wanderer's reach is against enemies like Wolf Lord that stall a lot while in the air. I will say that he has a lot more competition for that now. For basically every enemy, Neuvillette can aim high enough, even if he can't directly aim up, so there's still a few exceptions. But generally, you know, he can still have an upward angle, so as long as you go far away enough from the enemy, Neuvillette can, most of the time, be able to hit them. So Wanderer's ability to have really high reach doesn't stand out quite as much as it did the first time he came around, but it's still a useful thing if you don't have Neuvillette, or you don't like Neuvillette, or you just want to have a character that's animo that can do that. Now, overall, in terms of like value for an account, I think Wanderer is like really low. Outside of his exploration stuff, he just doesn't offer that much. If you are someone who's like focused only on the meta, I would only recommend pulling for Wanderer if you find yourself annoyed at overworld traversal. Now, that's not the case for everyone. Some people care about meta to some extent, but still have characters they like. And if you like Wanderer, there can be things that will make it so that he's unpleasant to play. When I'm trying to do a banner review, I try to categorize players in like 3 main different categories, or I guess 4. The people that are going to pull for him no matter what, because they just love the character and don't care about meta. The people that won't pull for him no matter what because they hate the character and don't care about meta. And those are like together, they're not going to gain anything from watching this video. And then the remaining 2 groups is people who care mostly about meta and very little about the character, whether it's because in general they don't care about the character's personalities or design or whatever, or because this specific character is kind of whatever to them. And then the group of people who actually kind of like his character, but don't want to spend a lot of Primo Gems on a character that they won't end up actually playing. I think that for the former, Wanderer is not a very good pull. He's just not the sort of unit that is going to do that much outside of the overworld stuff if you're trying to pull only for like the optimal stuff. For the latter though, people who actually like him but are wondering if it's actually worth the amount of Fremo gems that it takes, Wanderer is not the worst character. He can be pretty good for certain accounts, but there are a decent amount of situations where he feels awful to play, and you should know about those before you pull for him, because if you're planning on playing him in those situations, you are going to be disappointed. So, mainly, Wanderer in most content is very reliant on some form of defensive utility. Without a good form of resistance to interruption, he gets staggered very, very easily, and stagger hurts him a lot because he's in the air. So he just starts falling. Now, what that means is if you don't have a good generally shielder on your account, if you don't have Zhongli, you don't have a built Toma, you don't have a built Layla, he is very often going to feel awful to play. Honestly, to some extent, even in domains and overworld. That being said, if you do have some form of defensive utility, he generally feels completely fine to play. Now, you can play him without defensive utility, and it's not bad inherently, but I think that for most people it's just not going to be a pleasant experience, so it's not something I would generally end up recommending. Outside of that, his damage with a shielder without C6 Faruzan tends to be fine, but really noticeably not amazing. Still good enough to clear stuff, unless he gets hard countered by the content on the first side of this abyss. Especially without C6 Faruzan, do not play Wanderer against this. 70% animal resistance does not f her out. Unless he's soft or hard countered by the content, generally he's more than good enough to clear stuff without too much of a problem. If you are going to actually hyper invest into him and get him very well built. So all in all, if you're on the fence and feel like you can afford going for a character that isn't the best because either you're already 36 starring or you don't plan on playing him in Abyss, or you are going to go on his banner really hard, maybe either go for a constellation or two on him or go for his signature, or just you have really strong artifacts at the ready and a strong support team for him already, then green light, go for him if you have the primos for it, and he's gonna be alright. If you're more on the, okay, well, I kind of need a character to clear Abyss right now, I don't have C6 Faruzan, I'm far from C6 Faruzan, maybe this is more of a hold off for a better banner moment for you. For constellations, his C1 is alright. C2, it's nice for front load, it's nice for specific levels of investment where at C1 one rotation isn't enough to clear a boss, but at C2 one rotation is. It's also, kind of just alright. C3 is fine. C4 is fine. The reality is that at a baseline, you're almost always getting one of the best two. You're almost always getting the Pyro one, and the Hydro buff is nice in some situations where you just barely don't have enough damage without it, but in most situations it just doesn't do too much. The Electro buff also just doesn't do too much, and so in most situations this is just a 1 out of 3 to be good, and if that's the case then it's kind of But in situations where the Hydro buff is useful, then this is a bit better. But either way, for Constellation it's not all that great. C5 also not all that great, and then C6 is, it's a C6. It's not a bad C6, it's not an outstanding C6 either. It is a pretty good C6, to be fair. I think the main thing that holds C6 Wanderer back isn't really the strength of his individual constellations, but more so the fact that they don't really synergize with each other that much. Now that's not to say C6 Wanderer is bad, far from it. C6 Wanderer is one of the most popular whale speedrunning characters. He's fine at C6. I don't want to focus too much on cons. I think individually, when it comes to early cons, they're all fine. Next up, Faruzan, because a lot of it ties into Wanderer. One of the things that warped people's perception on Wanderer so much early on is that Wanderer is a lot stronger with C6 Faruzan. But because Faruzan was released at the same time as Wanderer on his banner, then for a lot of people, they either didn't get C6 Faruzan or got C6 Faruzan and Wanderer constellations. And the boost from C1 and potentially C2 versus someone who has C4 Faruzan, C0 Wanderer is pretty big. Now, a very good portion of that boost is Faruzan herself. So let's go over her. I think Faruzan is a unit who is at C0. The buff that she gives at C0, she gives damage percent, but the main thing that she provides is Animal Res Shred, which, because she's the only unit, Gene C4 excluded, to provide directly Animal Res Shred, makes it so that even if she's not that good at it, a good buff that you can't really stack tends to be useful to some extent. What I mean by that is the more Res Shred you have, the worse it becomes. Assuming a baseline 10% animal resistance enemy. Alright, this is the number we're interested in. 30% animal resistance shred on a basic enemy with 10% animal resistance, which is the default that enemies have, increases your damage by 22%. But if you have multiple ways of stacking it, like if you're looking, for example, at Pyro in a team with Arlecchino, Kazuha, Zhongli. If you're asking yourself, okay, should I use Zhongli or another shielder? How much is Zhongli doing for me? Well, you're starting at minus 30, and he's giving you 20% shred, which is an 8% increase. Whereas if you were to start at 10, it'd be a 16% increase. It's basically half as effective because you already have shred. So shred is a multiplier, or a debuff, whatever, that is very useful when you only have one source of it. And it becomes a little bit less useful the more of it you have. The other nice thing about shred is that against enemies with higher resistance than default, right? So if going back to Faruzan, looking at the damage increase against Coppelius, Faruzan doubles your damage just from the shred. That's a pretty big deal. In any case, because the shred is part of her base kit rather than constellations, she's fine at C0. That being said, she still has a lot of issues at C0. Pressing skill doesn't generate energy. It's doing your charge shot after pressing your skill. The explosion that happens after you do your charge shot is what can generate energy. What that means is if you want her to generate energy, you have to spend more time on her. You have to actually do a charge attack, an uninterrupted charge attack. The thing is, her charge attack doesn't hurt that much, especially when you're building her with the amount of VR that she is going to end up needing in a team like that, in most of her teams. That's a pretty big deal, right? The ER requirements that she has are a pretty big deal. And while C4 gives her a little bit of energy, it really just kind of doesn't, because you're only doing one charge shot per rotation in, for example, a Wanderer team, right? You're only doing at most one, if you even do it. Because if you can get away without having to do it, you'd rather build a 300 ER Faruzan that doesn't use skill, or that doesn't use a charge shot, than a 260% ER Faruzan that does. If you can actually reach the amount of ER that you're gonna need, you would rather not have to use your charge shot at all. But even if you use it, that's basically 2 energy per rotation. On an 80 cost burst, very, very insignificant. That being said, the C6 gives you the explosion from your ult. It keeps happening over and over inside your ult. And the charge attack has particle generation ICD, so you'll only generate particles from it about every 6 seconds. But effectively, C6 makes it so that she will generate basically 6 particles without having to do a charge shot, instead of 2 particles while having to do a charge shot. Just that part is a pretty huge deal already. Not just for her, because obviously it's going to significantly reduce her ER requirements, but also for the rest of your team. It makes everything in your team have lower ER requirements. On top of that, it gives 40% crit damage, and it makes it so you get your explosion, which actually deals non-insignificant damage. It's not a great amount of damage, but it's not nothing. You actually get these from off field. It also, not just for the damage, it also can keep enemies grouped more easily. Basically, what I'm getting at is the difference between a C5 Faruzan and a C6 Faruzan is massive. At C5, she's like a playable-ish unit that you can put on a team with another animal carry if you don't have anything too good for the slot already, or if you're against high-resistance enemies. At C6, she is the least replaceable unit on your team. At C6, you're keeping Faruzan before you're keeping Bennett on your Xiao team. That's why the Xianyun team with Xiao, the most popular one, the default one, has been Xianyun, Farina, Faruzan, not Xianyun, Farina, Bennett. Because at C6, the buff that she provides is just actually massive. Now, does that make her broken at C6? Not necessarily, but she is actually a good character at C6, although limited to only a few good teams, because she's a very specific niche character. Does that mean that she can only be played with Xiao and Wanderer? Not really. Well, I wouldn't really say that you should play other Faruzan teams if you have actual strong team options. If you know, are a little bit lost with what to do with your account, you ended up getting lucky on C6 Faruzan, you lost your 50-50, didn't get Wanderer or whatever, you can actually play her as a, like, in a quick swap team, as like a pseudo carry in her own right. You can play Faruzan, Bennett, Heizo Shangling. It's not anything all that crazy, but it is actually reasonably strong. I think there's honestly a pretty fair argument to be made that Faruzan is better than Wanderer or Xiao. She puts them on her back more so than the other way around. But again, that is only at C6. Before C6, at C5, she's honestly a pretty whatever unit. But she is a relatively future-proof unit in the sense that I think she'll have a place in any animal carry team for the foreseeable future. All of this to say, Faruzan is definitely one of the better units to have on a banner. He's not insane because he's not good in every team, and a lot of the teams where she ends up being good in are maybe not teams you're really going to want to play. I think that if you're going for Baizhu on this banner, it's very unlikely that Faruzan is good for you because her quick swap teams without Wanderer or Xiao are good, but they're not outstanding, and you actually have to get her to C6 for her to be playable in those teams. For those teams to be playable at all, actually. Going through her constellations individually, C1 lets her get 2 charge shots per E. If you are really like a Faruzan lover, you absolutely want to play her on field, whatever. This is a pretty big deal because it basically almost doubles her damage. Without this, you're going to be firing normal charge attacks instead, which is kind of whatever. It's also relatively impactful in the quick swap animo teams where it's a good way to fill your downtime. And it can be pretty fun if you want to play TF Faruzan and just spam her E and charge attack. You can actually get really good stagger with it because you're effectively permanently having your vortex effect, which is kind of fun. It's pretty cool. C2 is kind of worthless for Wanderer teams because generally Wanderer doesn't stay on field for that long, so the increased duration from ult doesn't matter too much. It's not completely useless because without it, you generally want to use your Faruzan ult a little bit later in your rotation, so it might end up costing you shield uptime or Bennett uptime, but it's not great. It's more so a constellation that's useful for Xiao, who stays on field for longer than Wanderer does. C3, it exists, I guess. C4, I already mentioned, is pretty worthless by itself. It becomes retroactively pretty good once you have C6 because you actually get a lot of hits from your pressurized collapses, so you get to generate energy a lot of times. But without C6, you only get it at most, generally basically just once per rotation, so it's not very good. C5, also kind of whatever. It slightly increases the damage percent bonus you give, but it's such a small increase that it just doesn't really make that big of a difference. And then finally, C6 obviously is the big one. Now, before we move on to the rest of the 4 stars, I want to look at Baizhu. I did Faruzan before Baizhu because I feel like she's so intertwined with Wanderer, but we can talk about Baizhu now. Baizhu is a very interesting character. I think Farina's release has helped him separate himself from the competition a little bit. I think previously there was like a potential issue, I guess, where Dendro teams are really mostly Hyperbloom and Quicken teams. There's not really Burning teams. There's not that many Burgeon teams. It's really mostly Hyperbloom and Quicken. And I guess Nilo as well. In Hyperbloom teams, you just don't have to sacrifice too much to use a healer on your Electro slot because Kuki is a pretty good Hyperbloom trigger. In Quicken teams, his better off-field application than Yao Yao doesn't really matter too much because you don't need good off-field application for Quicken. In Nilo teams, again, his off-field application doesn't matter as much because you get to have a bit more flexibility in your rotations generally, and the fact that a lot of his application is pretty small AoE or single target doesn't synergize that well with the Nilo teams, and generally Yao Yao just ends up being about as good, if not better. So what that means is that on release, Baizhu was far from a bad character, but he was a character where the difference between having him on your account or having Yao Yao on your account just was very small. That being said, a few patches later with Furina's release, a few of the things that he does differently from Yao Yao have started mattering a bit more. Furina has catapulted Quick Bloom teams into being a lot better than they used to be as a Hydro option that applies Hydro slow-ish, so you still get pretty good quicken up time, and gives a pretty big damage percent buff. In those teams, if you want to play a unit like the Ting or Sino as your carry, Baizhu is a pretty good option. Front loads his healing pretty well, which is really nice for Furina compared to Yao Yao. His resistance to interruption can be quite useful, especially for Sino. And his off-field application actually does matter a little bit because it helps you maintain slightly better quicken uptime, because your Hydro can end up eating away at your quicken aura. On top of that, he's also just a pretty nice healer option for default teams that both want to get a healer to max out Furina's passive, but still appreciate some sort of resistance to interruption. Because most of the actual good defensive units that provide good resistance to interruption don't really heal, so you can't really use them with Furina to max out her fanfare. You're going to end up with much lower fanfare. And so he can be used not really that much as a Dendro unit, but rather as a healer that provides resistance to interruption through his mini shields. Now, does that mean that Baizhu is an amazing unit now? I don't think so. I don't use him very often, but I do use him here and there. I think he definitely has a lot more use case now than he used to, and that's pretty cool. In terms of his constellations, his C1 is, in a lot of teams, actually quite good. His elemental skill has a 10-second cooldown. What that means is that in the average rotation, that's about 20 seconds, you can use it twice. However, you have to swap back to him every 10 seconds to do that. And some carries can't. When you're playing him in a Sino team, when you're playing him in a Wriothesley team, for example, it's just not really something you can really do. And so you end up only getting 1 E per rotation, whereas with 2 charges, you can actually get 2. What this means is that his C1 significantly alleviates his ER requirements. One thing that is worth mentioning is that in some teams that doesn't matter too much, because even if you build him full HP, his shields are paper thin, and even if you build him full damage, his healing is generally more than enough. What that means is that save a lot of ER doesn't actually do that much. Because what other stat are you going to build? You're going to, I don't know, build crit, I guess? Get a little bit of damage out of him, but like, he doesn't do a lot of damage. And so realistically, what this does, it doesn't really translate to more damage for your team. What it does do is it makes it so that teams that are pretty strict for energy at a baseline, teams that actually struggle to get enough energy just at all, like Wriothesley teams where you use him, will actually be able to get his burst every rotation. It's pretty useful for those teams. I think for Sino teams it's not that useful because generally you're either playing double Electro and you get Electro Resonance, which generates a decent amount of particles, and generally an Electro unit that also generates a decent amount of particles themselves, or you're playing double Dendro, which gets you a lot of Dendro particles. You can also play double Hydro, but I think generally in those teams, Baiju's not really recommended for Sino, because you just don't get enough Dendro uptime. You basically don't get any quicken uptime, and you barely get any Hyper Blooms. So all in all, the C1 is useful for teams that just can't reach the ER requirements, and it's kind of nice for those teams that it does do something pretty useful, but in other teams, it just doesn't really do much. C2 gives you additional off-field application that isn't actually reliant on you swapping into him. Basically, you get a little bit of off-field Dendro every 5 seconds without swapping into him ever. It's just something that happens. I think, unironically, the main use of it is there's a lot of teams where you want to start your rotation with your Hydro unit or your Electro unit, and this effectively ends up getting you 1 or 2 more Hyper Blooms at the very, very start of your first rotation, which is kind of nice. Other than that, it's also just, you know, it makes him useful without having to swap into him, which is kind of nice. Overall, it's an alright constellation. It's not game changing though. C3 is a constellation of all time. C4 is 80 Elemental Master. That is a constellation of all time. C5 is a constellation of all time, and C6 is honestly a constellation of all time as well. C6 helps his app, which is good, but it doesn't do nearly enough for a C6. Like, if you're an Omega Whale, you C6 a ton of characters, then having a more Nendo application on a healer might be useful, but if you only C6 a few characters, or if you only C6 one character, it definitely should not be Baizhu. This is a Leviathan constellation, and that's kind of it. Generally though, Baizhu doesn't gain too much from constellations. He's a character that's honestly very similar at C0 versus at C6. Alright, next up, we have Layla and Beidou. We can start with Layla. Layla is a decent character. The biggest thing about Layla is when you're looking at cryo options, she has some pretty direct competition in the shielder role with Diona. And I think that there are some situations where she's better than Diona, some situations where she's worse. I think the main issue with Layla is that she's just generally not competitive without any constellations. Because if you're looking at C6 Layla, what are her upsides over the alternatives? Well, if you're looking at her upsides over the alternatives in teams where you're mainly using her because she's a shielder, she has off-field cryo up, which is, you know, pretty useful in some teams. And if you're looking at her as an option versus, like, as an alternative to Diona, she has a bit of actual damage and a stronger shield. At C0, she basically does no damage and her shield sucks. Which means that Layla is a pretty constellation-dependent unit, not because there's an insanely big difference between C0 and C6, like is the case for Faruzan, but rather because she's just behind the competition at C0 in the situations where she's ahead at C6. That doesn't make her unplayable at C0. She's still fine, but you're gonna notice the shield breaking, you're gonna notice that she's not really doing much damage. If you're okay with that, then that's cool, but she's kinda, yeah. C1 significantly increases the strength of your shield and gives your team a shield in co-op. C2 is a bit of energy generation. C3 is what, skill talent, so it's also pretty sizable increase to the shield. C4 is worthless. It's a cool design for it, but it's such a small number that it effectively doesn't do shit. Like, thematically it's kind of cool, but it's just too small of a buff to actually do anything. C5 slightly increases her damage, but it's still not really enough to be relevant damage. And then C6 is a pretty big increase to her damage that compounds the C5 to make her not a great off-field damage dealer, but an actual little bit of damage for the shielder that does damage. Overall, I think Layla is not really used in too many teams. She's used for some Nevilette teams as an option if you think freeze can be useful. In this Abyss, for example, Layla's shield is stronger than Zhongli's shield against the Kenkis because the Kenkis do mostly cryo damage. Oh, that's not necessarily true. It depends which attack you're getting hit by. It's weaker than Zhongli's shield if you're getting hit by the Anemo attacks, but it's stronger if you're getting hit by the cryo attacks. But anyways, she's mostly used, yeah, for Nevilette teams. Sees some play in meld teams that want a shielder and some app, but generally that's more something that Diona is gonna do. She's a fine defensive option in Hyper Bloom for Hyperfridge stuff because you'll get to keep enemies frozen and have a pretty decent shield. She is a good defensive option for Mono Cryo, but Mono Cryo, it's mainly because the competition is fucking ass. The competition is awful for defensive options in Mono Cryo. None of them are very good. That's why she's fine there. Overall, she's an alright unit. Finally, we have Beidou, who I think is a very interesting character. Beidou is quite good, but she's somewhat restricted in both the teams where she can be played and the situations where she's exceptionally good, in a way that makes it so that she doesn't get played that often or by that many people. Back in the old days of 1.0, where enemies were fucking ruin guards just looking at you for half the fight, Beidou's biggest strength was the damage that she can do against two targets. Beidou's burst, when you activate it, gives you Thunder Beast's Targe, which when you hit enemies with normal and charge attacks, shocks them with lightning. And the lightning bolt will jump around from one enemy to another. If there are only two enemies, it can bounce back to the first enemy and deal damage multiple times. At C2, the base 3 instances of damage becomes 5. So in 2 targets, you're hitting your main target 3 times per proc. That makes her an actual pretty strong source of off-field damage in 2 target situations. On top of that, and I think the most overlooked part of her base 1.0 strength is, unlike most AoE units, if you're only hitting 2 enemies, you're still getting all the value from your ult. And if the enemies are relatively spread out, it's pretty easy for the ult to still get full value. Practically, characters outside of basically nowadays Neuvillette, characters that have AoE in AoE situations, most of the time don't actually hit all the enemies at the same time. And they're more so generally hitting like 2 out of 3 enemies. And that makes it so that Beidou is effectively doing the same amount of work compared to them in 3 targets as she is in 2 targets. There are obviously some exceptions to that, but I think that generally people underestimate how much Beidou can do in 3 and 4 target scenarios. On top of that, her elemental skill actually has a massive AoE, so it's basically guaranteed to hit every enemy if you're getting a parry. That being said, Beidou was not the best unit in 1.0. She was good, don't get me wrong, but she wasn't quite on the same level as units like Fischl, Xingqiu, Bennett, and Ling. And because of that, with years of playing, years of new units, we have gotten more and more strong units, which makes it so that Beidou's strength doesn't really stand out anymore. However, with time, we've also gotten enemies that are more and more aggressive, which has increased pretty significantly the value of defensive utility. And Beidou's Burst isn't just a pretty nice damage dealing ability, it's also a pretty sizable damage reduction. 37% less damage. Every damage you take is reduced by 37%. That's actually kind of nice. Now, as the sole form of defensive utility, that doesn't tend to really be enough for most people, but paired with healers, this makes it so that enemies that would otherwise basically trample you to death by hitting you over and over, enemies like Coppelia, for example, well, now they don't quite do so much damage that they're out damaging your healers, or that they can kill you before you get to swap to your healer. And that's actually a pretty big deal for Beidou. Her damage reduction is actually very useful. However, she is not a dedicated defensive utility option, and her main value is that she gives decent defensive utility while still giving good offensive utility. But in single target, her burst doesn't bounce, and so her damage is divided by 5, basically. And so she becomes significantly worse. Because of that, it makes her a situational team building choice, because, you know, some don't necessarily always want defensive utility. That also is situational when it comes to the scenarios where she's good. And that's why she really doesn't see that much play. I think that nowadays, Beidou is still a very strong option for Alhaitham Quicken, and to some extent Alhaitham Hyperbloom teams for people that don't have Nahida. She's just a pretty good option with Alhaitham, but she can't be solo Electro and Hyperbloom teams because she doesn't trigger Seeds with her ult. She is a pretty good option for Neuvillette. She's not the best, but she's still pretty good. She is a pretty good option for Chevaleur's teams that want defensive utility, because honestly, the defensive utility options for Pyro and Electro are fucking abysmal. That makes it so that her relatively weak defensive utility is kind of just really good compared to the alternatives. But yeah, so I think overall, I definitely do think she's underrated. I don't think she's as good as she was in 1.0, but I do think that there's a lot of people that could benefit from slotting her in their Alhaitham or Chevaleur's teams mainly. Outside of that, she is still pretty much always in my teams when I do 4-star only clears. She's still very much a synergistic unit with Fischl that does enough to justify being in that team. Right, like you can play her as a good source of damage in Quicken teams and Taser teams, but nowadays there's generally alternatives for those like Quicken and Taser teams that do end up clearing faster than she does. But she's still completely fine. Anyways, all this to say, Beidou is not one of the premium 4-stars for banners, but she is still very much a good one. Now, her constellations, C1 is a pretty big deal when it comes to her defensive utility. It doesn't seem like that much, because it isn't. 16% of her HP just isn't a very large amount, but it's actually more than that, because she has damage reduction, and that damage reduction applies before your incoming damage is calculated for your shield, and so it also makes this shield tankier. If you're stacking damage reduction with Beidou plus Xingqiu, this shield becomes basically unbreakable, but just with Beidou herself. It's a fine-ish shield. But while it's up, you have infinite resistance to interruption, which is nice. So it's still relatively useful. I think I've warmed up a lot to her C1 over the years. I used to think it wasn't that great, but again, right, with enemies getting more aggressive, I think it's pretty valuable now. C2 is obviously her biggest spike in terms of power offensively. It's quite good. C3 is whatever. Talent levels for your skill is fine. C4 is both worthless and great. By that I mean, generally it's pretty useful. It's pretty useless. You don't want to normal attack on Beidou. But very often with Beidou, you can find yourself in situations where you're trying to break shields. And Beidou, as a shield breaker, especially with C4, like, is actually really good at breaking shields. Especially in AoE, but still in single target. Beidou is actually one of the better shield breakers in the game, because she just applies so much of her element. And the C4 helps with that. It's not amazing, obviously, because you don't always care about the shield breaking, but in situations where you do care about the shield breaking, pretty good. C5, burst damage, it's alright. It's obviously not as big of an increase as the C2, but it's still fine. So you get 3% more damage reduction, which is kind of nice. Right, talent level 10 is 34%, which is basically a third less. Talent level 13 is 37, but it's mainly for the damage. And then C6, Electro Res Shred, which is also alright. It makes her a bit better as a support option for electro carries, but the character that should synergize the best with her being Raiden not working with her ult obviously hurts this a little bit. But I mean, just for her own personal damage and her damage and the official's damage, if you're playing her with official, it's pretty alright. But yeah, so overall, I think this banner is... I think each of the 4-stars individually is above average, but there's no 4-star that is outstanding. So I don't know if the 4-star lineup is actually above average, because you only have 8 unit slots in Abyss, and a slightly above average 4-star isn't actually that likely to actually make it onto your 2 teams. With a limited amount of characters that you want to be playing, I don't really know if it's actually that good to have 3 slightly above average characters. I think it's obviously a great banner for people who like Wanderer, because Faruzan is on it. Layla is a pretty decent option in some of Faruzan's teams as well. With the right setup, you can get both the cryo buff and the pyro buff for Wanderer if you're playing Bennett, Layla, Faruzan. I think for Baizhu it's not a great banner, but it's not that bad. God, now we gotta talk about this. Before we get into the actual analysis, I want to say I'm really sad. This banner makes me really sad because I need to get more Fav swords. I haven't gotten a Fav sword in basically the last 3 years. I've been wondering if I should go on the weapon banner the next time Fav sword comes around, and seeing this banner, it is going to be a resounding no. So personally, this banner makes me angry, but let's get into the analysis. Chiletala's Remembrance, or Wanderer's Bell, or the Bell, it's fine. The main issue, it's not that much better than Wanderer's other options, especially now with, if you play him with Farina, Risley's signature is like actually really good. It also doesn't buff his charge attack, which makes it so that in situations where you want to use your charge attack, it's not actually good. His optimal combos generally have charge attacks in them, unless you have his signature or constellations. But honestly, with Abyss getting more and more focused on aggressive enemies, I think at this point you're better off focusing on just not dying on a Wanderer than you are focusing on getting perfect combos. Overall, it's a fine weapon. Like, it's not worthless, but it's definitely one of the weaker signature weapons. It's fine. Jadefall Splendor is not good. It obviously helps with Baiju's ER requirements, but why does it give him damage? He doesn't do damage. Giving him a little bit more damage is worthless. It's not a good weapon. If you think it looks aesthetically pleasing, I think that's a much better reason to go for it than if you think it's good on Baizhu. Looking at the 4-star lineup, Range Gauge is actually a pretty good bow. It's not so good that it's great at low refine, and weapon banner exclusive weapons don't tend to be high refined for most people. But if you don't have the greatest 4-star options and you don't have 5-star stat sticks, it can be a pretty alright weapon for some characters. Fav Sword is really good. I think, in my opinion, it's the best sword to have on a weapon banner for the 4-stars. And it's also up there with Fav Lance as the most useful Fav weapons, because there's just so many sword characters that are good and that want Fav. Prospectors Drill is definitely a weapon of all time. I mean, it's the same thing as Range Gauge when it comes to like bow both the effect and the stats. There's a lot more competition for sort of free-to-play polearms, which makes Prospectors Drill generally kind of worthless for most people, because it just doesn't really have too many characters that both it is good on and that don't have other great options. Sacrificial Fragments is... It's good. It's obviously quite good on Sucrose. It's good on Kokomi or Barbara if you're using them in Nilo teams. It's a fine stat stick for Nahida as well. It's fine. And then Rainslasher is basically it's a fine Diluc weapon. I guess now you can also say that it's a fine Gaming weapon, but it's not that much better than Mailed Flower, and it doesn't work on Melt for either of them. Yeah, I guess Rainslasher is also fine on Quick and Beidou, but it's not great. None of these weapons, and that's something that doesn't happen that often. None of these weapons are bad, but the 5-star lineup is so awful that I still don't think it's a great banner. If you want to actually, you really like Wanderer, you absolutely want to get a signature, it's a fine weapon for that. If, God forbid, you really like Baizhu and think that his signature weapon is just too pretty to skip, find God. I mean, it's fine. But I really think other than that, it's not that great. Because the bell is just not good enough on Wanderer to justify rolling on a banner where getting the wrong signature means you're getting a fucking green donut. And while the 4 stars are fine, both Range Gauge and Prospectors Drill are very unlikely to actually end up being played on any of your characters unless they actually end up reaching high refine. But yeah, that's going to do it for the banner review. This was a pretty long one. Let me know what you guys think. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.